Remember when 1950s Milwaukee felt like the safest, sunniest place on television? From 1974 to 1984, Happy Days made millions of viewers believe that life at Arnold's Drive-In was as simple as a milkshake and a jukebox tune. But behind that wholesome image, the real story of this sitcom was a lot stranger than anyone watching from their living room ever guessed. We are talking about a leading man who was terrified of the very motorcycle his character rode, a beloved son who vanished from the show without a single word of explanation, and an alien from outer space who almost never got hired at all. And trust us, the story near the top of this list is even stranger than you remember. So hit that like button, subscribe if you have not already, and get ready because we are counting down 15 weird facts about Happy Days that most fans never knew, the kind of details that rarely make it into highlight reels or clip compilations. Let's start with number 15. Number 15. A different father for the Cunningham family. When the original Happy Days pilot was filmed as part of Love, American Style, the role of Howard Cunningham was not played by Tom Bosley at all. Actor Harold Gould originated the role in that 1972 pilot segment. By the time the full series moved forward, Gould was tied up with theater commitments and could not commit to a weekly show. So producers needed someone else to play America's favorite hardware store dad. Enter Tom Bosley, who stepped into penny loafers, cardigan and all, and quickly made the role his own for the next 11 seasons. Bosley grew so attached to Milwaukee's most patient patriarch that Howard Cunningham essentially became inseparable from his public image for the rest of his career, appearing in wholesome father figure roles for decades afterward. Funny enough, Bosley almost turned down sitcom work altogether after building a respected career on Broadway. He worried a weekly comedy might feel like a step down. Instead, it turned into the defining role of his career, and one of the most beloved TV dads in American history. So next time you rewatch those early episodes, remember, the man handing out fatherly advice in the pilot and the man doing it for the next decade were never meant to be the same actor at all. It is a strange footnote considering how completely viewers came to associate that warm, patient delivery with Bosley specifically, to the point that most fans today have no idea the family patriarch very nearly had an entirely different face and voice from the very beginning of the series. Watching those two versions of the same family side by side today feels like a strange alternate timeline nobody planned. A reminder that even the most comforting sitcom fixtures started out as replaceable production decisions. Number 14. The show almost never got made at all. Long before Milwaukee's most famous drive-in existed, the Cunningham family began as a 5-minute segment inside the anthology series Love, American Style, in a 1972 episode called Love and the Happy Days. ABC liked the response enough to shoot a full pilot under the working title New Family in Town, set firmly in the 1950s. Sounds promising, right? Not exactly. Every single network passed on it. Paramount even pushed creator Gary Marshall to move the setting into the 1920s instead. But Marshall refused, insisting the story only worked in the 50s world he remembered from his own childhood. For an entire year, the finished pilot sat on a shelf gathering dust, rejected and seemingly forgotten. Then in 1973, a nostalgic teenage movie about cruising and doo-wop music called American Graffiti became a massive box office hit, and it happened to star a young actor named Ron Howard. Suddenly, network executives who once ignored an unaired 50s pilot were paying very close attention to it again. ABC dusted it off, slotted it in to replace a struggling series called Temperatures Rising, and Happy Days finally premiered in January of 1974. In other words, one of television's most successful sitcoms almost never left the shelf, and it took a completely unrelated movie to save it. Had that nostalgic teen movie flopped instead of becoming a box office sensation, there is a real chance the pilot would have stayed exactly where it was, quietly shelved and forgotten. And an entire decade of Milwaukee nostalgia would simply never have reached television screens at all. It remains one of the more overlooked ironies of the era that a movie with no direct connection to the Cunninghams effectively decided their fate. Number 13. Happy Days almost had a completely different name. Before anyone agreed on the title Happy Days, the show's creative team seriously considered calling it Cool instead. It fit the 1950s greaser aesthetic, it sounded punchy, and it matched the attitude producers wanted Fonzie to bring to the screen. But here's where it gets weird. When the title was tested with a focus group of viewers, the word cool did not conjure up leather jackets or milkshakes at all. Instead, testers kept associating it with menthol cigarette packaging, since several popular cigarette brands at the time used the exact same word in their advertising. Not exactly the wholesome family image ABC was going for. Producer Carl Kleinschmidt is credited with steering the show away from that branding disaster and toward the far warmer, far safer title, Happy Days instead. A name that captured the nostalgic, feel-good tone the network actually wanted. It is strange to imagine an entire cultural phenomenon, complete with catchphrases, lunchboxes, and a wax museum's worth of merchandise, existing instead under a name that tested like a tobacco slogan. Somehow, the safer choice turned out to be the more iconic one, and Happy Days went on to define an entire era of American television, under a title that very nearly never happened. It is worth pointing out how differently the show's entire branding would have unfolded under the rejected title. From the opening theme song lyrics to the merchandise lining store shelves throughout the 70s, all built around a word that test audiences could not separate from a cigarette carton. Even the show's earliest promotional materials had to be quietly reworked once the new title was locked in. A scramble barely anyone outside the production office ever knew was happening. Number 12. Fonzie's leather jacket was banned before it ever caught on. When Henry Winkler first showed up to play greaser mechanic Arthur Fonzarelli, the script actually called for a soft cloth jacket and a pair of penny loafers, nothing close to the leather-clad image fans would later worship. Winkler had other ideas, arriving on set in black leather boots and a leather jacket instead. ABC's censors were not thrilled. Network executives worried that dressing him head to toe in leather would make Fonzie look less like a lovable rebel and more like an actual hoodlum, which was a real concern for a family sitcom airing in the early evening. So, for the first stretch of episodes, Fonzie was quietly downgraded to a plain gray windbreaker instead, robbing the character of the exact look that would eventually make him a merchandising empire. Creator Gary Marshall found a clever workaround. If Fonzie was near his motorcycle, the leather jacket could technically be classified as safety gear rather than a fashion statement, so Marshall made sure to keep Fonzie close to his bike in nearly every scene. Once ratings started climbing, and the leather jacket clearly was not scaring anyone off, ABC finally relented and let Fonzie wear it everywhere. That same jacket eventually became so culturally significant that one of Winkler's originals now sits on permanent display at the Smithsonian Institution, proof that the network's biggest fashion fear turned into the show's most iconic costume piece. Decades later, that same jacket remains one of the most requested pieces of television memorabilia in existence, regularly cited by costume historians as one of the defining wardrobe choices in sitcom history, all stemming from a garment the network originally viewed as a genuine image problem. It remains a favorite piece of trivia among costume historians today. Number 11. Fonzie almost went to a completely different actor. It is hard to picture anyone besides Henry Winkler snapping his fingers and starting jukeboxes with a single knock. But casting him as Fonzie was not a sure thing at all. Producer Tom Miller was immediately taken with Winkler's audition, but when he brought the young actor's name to creator Gary Marshall, the response was reportedly less than enthusiastic, with Marshall openly questioning whether this particular actor was really his vision of Fonzie. Winkler was reluctantly cast anyway, but the hesitation did not stop there. In the very first episode, the character barely had any lines at all, treated more like background scenery than a future breakout star. Winkler, a classically trained dramatic actor, quietly set out to change that from the inside. He pushed back on scripted details that did not feel authentic to him, reworking small character choices until Fonzie's tougher edges softened into something far more human and likable on screen. It worked almost too well. Within a couple of seasons, the network was so worried about losing Winkler that Paramount reportedly built protective clauses into contracts to keep other cast members from feeling shortchanged as Fonzie's fame exploded. The actor, barely given any dialogue in episode 1, ended up becoming the reason Happy Days climbed to the very top of the ratings. Looking back, it is easy to forget just how close the show came to handing its most valuable character to a performer with far less patience for reshaping a thin role into something audiences would eventually adore. Marshall himself later spoke openly about underestimating Winkler's instincts, admitting that the character audiences fell hardest for was almost the one he was least sure about handing the role to in the first place. Number 10. The Fonz was secretly terrified of motorcycles. On screen, nobody looked more at home on two wheels than Arthur Fonzarelli, leaning against his bike with total confidence in every single scene. Off camera, the reality could not have been more different. Henry Winkler was genuinely afraid of motorcycles for the entire run of the series, which created an obvious problem for a character whose entire identity revolved around riding one. The production solution was refreshingly simple and more than a little theatrical. For most riding shots, Fonzie's motorcycle was not actually being driven at all. Instead, it was mounted onto a platform and towed behind a truck, letting Winkler sit confidently in place without ever needing to operate the thing he was quietly terrified of. From the camera's angle, viewers saw a fearless rebel cruising the streets of Milwaukee. From behind the scenes, crew members saw a platform, a tow truck, and a leading man doing his best not to look nervous. It is a small detail, but it says a lot about how much illusion goes into building a television icon. The character millions of young viewers wanted to imitate, right down to buying their own leather jackets, was played by a man who never fully got comfortable around the machine that defined him. Winkler has spoken candidly about it in interviews over the years, treating the irony with good humor. Since the actor most associated with motorcycle culture in American television spent over a decade quietly relieved every time the crew wheeled that towed platform back into position. It is the kind of gap between performance and reality that rarely gets acknowledged, since audiences at the time had no reason to question what looked, from every camera angle available, like total confidence on two wheels. Number 9. Fonzie's most famous gesture was never in the script. Henry Winkler cared deeply about keeping Fonzie likable rather than threatening, and he drew a personal line the network never crossed. He reportedly promised himself the character would never be shown with a rolled-up pack of cigarettes in his sleeve, and would never be seen combing his hair on camera, both common visual shorthand at the time for troublemakers and hoodlums. When a director once pushed for a scene where Fonzie combed his hair in front of a mirror, Winkler resisted, arguing it would undercut the character's harmless charm. What happened next became one of the show's most memorable improvised beats. Rather than combing his hair as written, Winkler simply glanced into the mirror, decided his hair was already perfect, and walked away without touching it, a small, on-the-spot decision that ended up defining Fonzie's vanity far better than any scripted line could have. That instinct for protecting the character's image extended everywhere, from wardrobe choices to body language, and it is a big part of why Fonzie read as cool and safe at the same time, a rare combination for a leather-jacketed greaser on a network sitcom. What looked like effortless swagger on screen was really the result of one actor constantly fighting to keep his character exactly as harmless as the network needed him to be. That level of self-imposed discipline extended to nearly every choice Winkler made in the role, and it is a big part of why parents felt comfortable letting their children idolize a leather-jacketed greaser in the first place, something far rarer in television than audiences at the time probably realized. It is a small reminder that some of television's most quoted, most imitated moments were never actually written down on a page at all. Number 8. A behind-the-scenes format change saved the entire show. By its second season, Happy Days was doing fine, but nowhere near the cultural phenomenon it would soon become. Then producers made a change that had nothing to do with the writing and everything to do with how the show was actually filmed. For its first 2 years, Happy Days was shot single camera style on a closed set, with each scene filmed multiple times from different angles, like a small movie production. Starting in season 3, the format flipped entirely. The show switched to a 3-camera setup, performed live in front of a real studio audience. The same style used by classic sitcoms built around comic timing and instant crowd reaction. The difference was immediate. Actors could feel exactly which jokes landed and which ones did not, and performances noticeably sharpened as a result. Audiences at home responded just as fast. The show climbed from a respectable mid-pack performer into the 10th most-watched program in the country that season, then rocketed all the way to number 1 the very next year. In other words, the The biggest single boost Happy Days ever received had almost nothing to do with plot twists or new characters, and everything to do with adding a live crowd and letting the cast actually hear people laugh. Cast members later described the shift as transformative in a way no script rewrite could have matched, since performing for a room full of real people forced sharper delivery, tighter pauses, and a level of energy that simply could not be manufactured, take after take, on a closed, camera-only set. Looking back, it is remarkable how a purely technical decision about camera setups ended up reshaping the entire trajectory of the series, far more than any single storyline ever could. Okay, we have to pause the countdown for just a second, because if these behind-the-scenes secrets are surprising you, imagine what is still coming. Do us a quick favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you have not already, and let us know in the comments which one of these facts has caught you off guard the most so far. It genuinely helps us keep making deep dives like this one, and it lets us know exactly which shows you want us to cover next. Alright, let's jump back into the countdown, because the reveals from here only get stranger, starting with number 7. Number 7. The music at Arnold's was not quite what it seemed. Every episode of Happy Days leaned heavily on nostalgic 1950s music pouring out of the jukebox at Arnold's Drive-In, the emotional heartbeat of the entire show. But here is the twist most viewers never picked up on. Licensing real hit songs from that era was expensive, especially in the show's earlier, tighter-budgeted seasons, so producers could not always afford to use the original recordings by the original artists. Instead, many of those jukebox classics were quietly re-recorded by a member of the cast. Anson Williams, who played the lovably awkward Potsy, turned out to have a genuinely strong singing voice, and he stepped in more than once to provide music for the show when the real recordings were out of budget. On top of the music itself, there is the jukebox mythology that grew around Fonzie specifically. Within the story, Fonzie was the only character who could reliably get that machine working, usually with a single confident thump of his fist rather than a coin. It became one of his most recognizable pieces of business, repeated so often that audiences started expecting it every episode. So the next time a nostalgic tune plays behind a scene at Arnold's, there is a real chance the voice powering that nostalgia belonged to Potsy, not to the artist whose name you would expect on the record. It is a small production detail that most casual viewers never notice, buried underneath the nostalgia of the setting itself. Yet it says a lot about how resourceful sitcom production teams of that era had to be when budgets did not stretch nearly as far as audiences assumed they did. It is a detail that rarely makes it into official retrospectives, yet it shaped the sound of the show just as much as any credited musician ever did. Number 6. A Cunningham son vanished, and nobody in the show ever explained it. For the first 2 seasons, Richie and Joni technically had an older brother named Chuck, a basketball-obsessed teenager who mostly wandered through scenes dribbling a ball and raiding the refrigerator. Then, after a Christmas-themed episode in Season 2, Chuck simply disappeared. No goodbye scene, no mention of him moving out, no explanation offered to the audience at all. Later seasons quietly rewrote the Cunningham family history, so that Richie was treated as the oldest child, as if Chuck had genuinely never existed in the first place. Behind the scenes, the reason turns out to be far less mysterious than fans imagined for decades. The actor originally cast in the role, Gavin O'Herlihy, was unhappy with how small and undeveloped the part was, and asked to be released from his contract. A second actor briefly took over the role for 2 more episodes before producers simply gave up on the character altogether rather than recasting a 3rd time. Gary Marshall later admitted the decision was almost casual, essentially deciding to let Chuck vanish and see how many letters of complaint came in. Barely any did. That quiet, low-drama exit became so well known in television circles that it eventually gave rise to an entire industry term, Chuck Cunningham syndrome, used whenever a show erases a character without ever addressing it on screen. Decades later, the actor who originated the role spoke publicly about his side of the story, confirming that his own dissatisfaction, rather than any dramatic falling out, was the real and rather ordinary reason behind one of television's most enduring unsolved mysteries. It remains one of the more casually resolved exits in sitcom history, given how much speculation it later generated among fans who assumed something far more dramatic must have happened. Number 5. The alien who almost was not cast changed television history. In Season 5, an episode called My Favorite Orkin introduced a strange visitor from outer space named Mork, sent to observe life on Earth after Richie claims to have seen a flying saucer. What almost nobody remembers is how close that role came to going to someone else entirely. Producers first approached an actor best known for playing a sheriff in a short-lived Mel Brooks sitcom, who ultimately backed out before filming began. They then tried to recruit veteran comic actor Dom DeLuise, who turned the part down as well. It was only after an associate producer happened to catch a little-known stand-up comedian performing a spaceman bit in his live act that anyone thought to call Robin Williams. Williams arrived for his audition and, rather than simply sitting in the offered chair like every other actor that day, sat on his head instead. Creator Gary Marshall reportedly cast him on the spot, later joking that Williams was the only actual alien who auditioned for the role. The finished episode drew such an overwhelming standing ovation from the studio audience that Marshall pitched a spin-off to network executives almost immediately afterward. 7 months later, Mork and Mindy premiered, launching one of the most legendary comedy careers in entertainment history, from what very nearly became a footnote guest appearance on somebody else's sitcom. Cast members who were on set that day have described the read-through as unlike anything they had witnessed before, with veteran actors visibly stunned by how quickly an unfamiliar performer commanded the entire room, long before anyone in the audience at home had any idea who Robin Williams was. It is a rare case of a spin-off outgrowing its origin story, since many casual viewers today have no idea Mork ever set foot in Milwaukee first. Number 4. One water skiing stunt gave the entire television industry a new insult. During a September 1977 episode, Fonzie accepted a dare to water ski and, in classic leather jacket and denim shorts, launched himself directly over a live shark. Sounds harmless enough, right? Not exactly. The stunt reportedly started as a piece of trivia rather than a planned storyline. Henry Winkler mentioned to castmates that he had once worked as a water ski instructor, and writers decided that skill was simply too good not to use somehow. What began as an offbeat way to showcase an actor's real-life hobby ended up defining an entire cultural phrase. Critics and fans alike began treating the shark-jumping stunt as the exact moment Happy Days pivoted from grounded, character-driven storytelling toward increasingly outlandish spectacle. In the decades since, jumping the shark has become permanent shorthand across television criticism, used anytime a long-running show reaches for an increasingly desperate twist to hold on to its audience. What makes it even funnier is that Happy Days was still enormously popular for years after that episode aired, meaning the moment that supposedly ruined the show, according to internet folklore, barely dented its ratings at all. The insult outlived the controversy by decades, and it is still the very first thing many casual fans remember about the series. Ironically, the very episode blamed for supposedly derailing the show has become one of its most fondly remembered moments, proving that sometimes the scene fans mock the hardest is also the one they never quite forget. It says something about the show's overall popularity that a single ridiculous stunt, still repeated decades later as a punchline, never actually cost the series its enormous audience. Number 3. Fonzie's popularity became powerful enough to genuinely worry the network. By the height of the show's success, Fonzie was not just a beloved television character. He was something closer to a real cultural authority figure for younger viewers. That influence became startlingly clear one day when a distressed teenage boy, reportedly going through a devastating personal crisis, called directly into Paramount Studios and asked to speak with Fonzie, treating the fictional character as someone who might genuinely be able to help him. It is a heavy, sobering detail buried inside an otherwise lighthearted, nostalgic sitcom, and it says everything about how deeply audiences, especially young ones, connected with Henry Winkler's performance. Fonzie was written as tough on the surface but quietly decent underneath, a rebel who ultimately respected his elders, protected his friends, and modeled surprisingly thoughtful behavior for a character wearing a leather jacket. That combination clearly resonated far beyond typical television fandom. It also explains why the show's producers worked so hard, from wardrobe choices to scripted storylines, to keep Fonzie's image responsible rather than reckless, since so many young viewers were quite literally looking up to him. What started as a minor supporting character, barely given lines in the pilot episode, had, within just a few seasons, become someone real families were trusting with their children's emotional well-being, whether the show's creators originally intended that or not. It placed an unusual and largely unspoken weight on the production, since every scripted decision about how Fonzie handled conflict, treated his friends, or resolved a problem carried real influence far beyond the studio audience clapping along in front of the cameras. It remains one of the more sobering footnotes in the show's otherwise cheerful legacy. Number 2. Fonzie became such a national phenomenon that fan mail barely needed an address. By the mid-1970s, Fonzie's signature thumbs-up gesture and single-syllable exclamation had become genuinely inescapable across American pop culture, showing up on lunchboxes, t-shirts, and playgrounds nationwide. Kids everywhere were imitating his finger snap, his walk, and his catchphrase, turning a supporting mechanic character into arguably the most recognizable figure on television at the time. That level of fame reportedly reached an almost absurd extreme when it came to fan mail. According to longtime accounts from the production, letters addressed with nothing more specific than the character's name and the city of Milwaukee still managed to find their way to the show, postal workers apparently having little trouble figuring out exactly who admirers meant. It is a small, almost unbelievable detail, but it captures just how completely Fonzie had taken over the national conversation by that point in the show's run. And what makes it even stranger is that this level of fame belonged to a character the show's own creator was initially unsure about casting and who barely spoke in the very first episode. Somehow, the reluctant afterthought became so famous that an entire country's postal system quietly adjusted to accommodate him. Merchandise carrying his image sold in numbers that reportedly startled even the network's own marketing department, turning a mechanic character from a mid-budget family sitcom into one of the single most recognizable faces in the entire country almost overnight. It is the kind of detail that sounds almost too exaggerated to be true, yet it captures exactly how thoroughly one supporting character had taken over the national conversation by the mid-70s. Number 1. Fonzie's leather jacket earned a permanent place in American history. After more than a decade defining cool for an entire generation of viewers, Fonzie's leather jacket did not just fade into television memorabilia storage like most costume pieces eventually do. Instead, one of Henry Winkler's original jackets from the series was formally added to the collection at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., placing a mechanic's costume from a 1970s sitcom in the same institution that preserves pieces of genuine national history. It is a remarkable landing spot for a costume piece the network almost refused to let the character wear at all in those very first episodes, when executives feared it made him look too much like a hoodlum. Believe it or not, the character built around that jacket went on to influence far more than fashion. Happy Days eventually spun off multiple additional hit series, built around characters first introduced within its world, expanding an already massive franchise even further, and cementing Milwaukee's fictional drive-in as one of the most influential settings in American sitcom history. From a rejected pilot that sat on a shelf for a year, to a jacket the network did not even want, to a permanent museum exhibit, the journey of Happy Days stands as proof that some of television's biggest cultural landmarks start out as the shows nobody was originally confident about at all. For a series that spent its first year fighting simply to get made, and its first few episodes fighting over what its own leading man was allowed to wear, ending up permanently preserved alongside genuine artifacts of American history, is about as unlikely a happy ending as television has ever produced. Few sitcom costumes anywhere have traveled that particular distance, from network liability to national landmark. And there you have it, 15 wild and surprising facts about Happy Days that even longtime fans rarely hear about. Which one caught you completely off guard? And which strange behind-the-scenes secret did we miss? Drop it in the comments because we genuinely love hearing which memories and details mean the most to you. And if you enjoyed digging into the real story behind one of television's most beloved sitcoms, make sure to subscribe and stick around because we have got plenty more nostalgic deep dives into the shows, stars, and secrets you grew up with still on the way. And there is a good chance the next one lands on a show you have been waiting to see us cover.